Welcome to the Afterglow podcast, a space to practice Yoga Nidra informed by the ideas of Carl Jung and internal family systems. Each week we will work on a different life theme, giving us the opportunity to discover vast inner landscapes, sitting with all that life has to offer as we explore who we are. May the afterglow be as bright as the journey is deep. This week I offer those going through chemotherapy or with diagnosed cancer a specifically designed Yoga Nidra to use frequently as a psychological tool to support you through the darkest parts of this procedure. The toll of chemo really affects the body, but it also affects the mind. And without a mental resolve, without an internal space to return to, the experience is much harder. I offer this Yoga Nidra practice to all who seek support through this time. A quick disclaimer. I am not a medical doctor. In no way am I representing myself as having professional opinions that listeners should follow. What I discuss here today and what I share is for educational or information purposes and does not substitute seeking professional medical advice. I am in no way representing practices or results as replicable or scientific. Always seek professional medical advice and ensure that you receive proper treatment for all physiological and psychological symptoms and conditions. I would like to dedicate this episode to one of my teachers, Claudia Rauber. Claudia was an incredible force in this world. She was intense and held an aliveness that I have seldom seen displayed so consistently in a person that I have known in real life. Claudia died in 2018 from breast cancer. Her death sent a ripple effect through the community because she was the healthiest person that I knew, that we all knew. Everything about her lifestyle meant that she should have lived into her hundreds. Claudia's death drove home the sobering fact that we can do what we can and the rest of us out of our control. It is with that simple sentiment that I offer this week's theme, a Yoga Nidra to help with the psychological burden that comes with chemotherapy. Thank you, Claudia, for intensity and humor. I offer you tobacco and beer. There are many types of chemotherapy treatments, often provided in combination with other modalities. Chemotherapy duration or type will of course be different for each person based on their specific needs or available procedures. The Yoga Nidra that I will upload in a few days aims to meet you where you are, at whatever stage in your experience. You can start using this Nidra and using it as often as you feel called to straight away. My intention for the Yoga Nidra that will be uploaded in a few days is to provide anyone experiencing chemotherapy or with a cancer diagnosis the use of a golden rope, a piece of practical material to use as you progress through the experience of expelling this disease. As I was writing the script for this episode, I was going to include accounts of people that I've worked with who have undergone chemotherapy and used Yoga Nidra to support them. And while doing research, I stumbled across a psychology thesis published through California State University in 2010 by Ross Hygard. After reading through the entirety of it, some 120 pages, I decided that the best companion I can give you to accompany this Yoga Nidra is excerpts from his thesis. Hygard survived a particularly harrowing experience of not only chemotherapy, but the concurrent fracturing of all areas of his life. His thesis is a beautifully laid out narrative account of his experience of chemotherapy, written through the lens of Jungian stages of the alchemical process as a way to frame his individuation. As I've never experienced chemotherapy, it feels more honest to share his lived experience, and because it is written with such grace and honesty, I believe that it's relatable to all, regardless of whether they're going through this experience or not. The thesis is called The Leaving Place, Curative Poisons and the Alchemy of Chemotherapy. I will add the link to the show notes, and I really encourage anyone interested to read the full thesis, as it is a very moving story. Hygd, and I really hope at this point that I'm pronouncing his surname correctly. I did Google and I couldn't find pronunciation. Hygerd. Hygd describes the initial process of his experience in comparison to the stages of symbolic, physical, and psychological alchemy. He goes into more detail than I will here, and I do recommend reading the full thesis again, but in the interest of time, I'll just be selecting key passages from the physical and psychological experiences as he progresses through each stage of his transformational process. As an aside, this Jungian Life is doing a series of episodes, each episode covering a stage of the process of psychological alchemy. At the time of recording this, they have released the first 2 stages. I recommend listening for anyone who is interested in the application of these concepts. Hygd explains that his cancer diagnosis and subsequent chemotherapy treatment started with an explosive life change, as his 6-year-long relationship ended and he found himself homeless and alone, about to undergo a terrifying journey into chemo. Hygd describes the first stage of the alchemical process, calcinatio, as being the explosion that ended the relationship and forced him onto this solitary path. He describes that before this he had been in a state of life that was disconnected, holding fast to the rocks that made up his psyche and life as he knew it. He writes, "I remained lost in my encounter with the unconscious for a number of years." And then he immediately starts quoting Jung, which is always a good sign. "There is always the danger," says Jung, "that those who set out in this realm will grow fast to the rocks." Hygd continues, "I had indeed become stuck to those rocks. I was freed from this entrapment in a most unusual way when I exploded as a result of my own inflation. When I argued with my partner and was cast into the chaos of the initial stages of my cancer treatment, I was freed from those rocks and launched into the massa confusa of the calcination phase. I suffered this regression into my own unconscious as I was overwhelmed by fear, and I struggled for my own survival. I lost all faculty of discrimination as I simply ran for my life without the slightest idea of where I was headed." It's in this stage of calcination that my favorite passage occurs in the entire thesis. Hygd describes how intellectual his life had become in recent years, how lacking in feeling responses. While receiving chemotherapy, Hygd, now homeless, was able to receive a small amount of disability funding to cover the cost of hotels during bouts of hospital visits for chemotherapy. In between his chemotherapy sessions, he camped and lived off of the land through fishing. It was during one of his stints at a motel that the events of this passage take place. He writes, My ability to feel had become increasingly stifled over the years as my intellectual thinking function became the controller of my psyche. I now began to be overwhelmed by powerful emotions. For instance, I knew there were only a few days of nice weather left before the rain set in, so as mentioned above, I went camping. I purchased a tent and other camping supplies, and one night, while practicing the assembly of my tent in the parking lot of a Palo Alto motel, I was struck by the powerful smell of jasmine. It was a very warm October evening, and the scent rode on the balmy air. This was a sense of smell greater than normal. The scent soaked my cells, and I began to cry. I sought the source and found the blooming bush next to the hotel's garbage dumpster. I broke off a large branch and took it back to my room, where I placed it on top of the lamp, so the heat from the lamp might keep the smell alive. What Heigert is describing here is that through this calcination process, this explosive time where everything is thrown up in the air and seemingly falling apart, he is experiencing an explosion of feeling. The time of chemotherapy, while undeniably debilitating, has allowed an important function to return, to come in full force, ready to respond to the subtle and the soft, the beauty of nature in bloom alongside a dumpster at the back of a motel, is enough of a symbol of, yes, hope, but also the balancing of the opposites. The second stage of the alchemical process is solutio, or dissolution. This stage is often symbolized through water, through the idea of dissolving, becoming somewhat undone. Heigert writes about this experience as being the literal treatment of the chemotherapy drugs flooding his system. He writes, "The procedure of solutio is very palpable to me, as every day in chemotherapy I felt as if my cellular constitution was being burned by the chemotherapy drugs and then flooded with saline. In fact, it seemed as if this ritual was enacted multiple times each day as I received alternating doses of drugs. I was heated and cooled, heated and cooled. Likewise, after every long course, I was drawn to the calming elixir of the ocean. I knew why my desire to fish had grown so strong. It was the sea calling me home. Despite my fantastic fear and the turmoil into which I had been thrust, I felt very comfortable while at the beach. In a psychological sense, I was in close contact with my unconscious. I was very aware of this contact with the unconscious as I stared at the sea. The chaos I had been lost in seemed to pulse as I stared at the ocean, thought of my encounter with the jellyfish, whales, and other sea mammals, walked amongst the tidal pools, and lived in the ebb and flow of the sea. I was able to integrate the ebb and flow of chemotherapy medication with the psychic revitalization I was beginning to experience after the initial chaos. The next stage is separation, and I will be reading quite a long section from his thesis as Heigert describes what he experienced in this stage of separation and this process post-chemotherapy. And I think that in a way, reading a longer passage matches the endurance of his recovery. He writes, "I had undergone an intensive physical experience of calcination and solution via my chemotherapy treatment. It was now time to determine if my body contained any residue of ungenuine or unworthy material. any remnants of cancer within it. At the conclusion of my 3rd round of chemotherapy, I submitted blood tests and took another CT scan in order to determine whether the tumors on my aorta had been effectively treated. The tests indicated that I had what the doctors called residual mass that needed to be removed. I was not very hopeful. I somehow knew that my journey was not over. I was scheduled for a bilateral lumpectomy, a surgical procedure wherein a large incision is made in the abdomen. The intestines and vital organs are removed from the body in order to make room for the surgeons to remove the cancerous lymph nodes from the aorta near the spine. Afterwards, the vital organs are placed back into the abdomen, and the incision is sealed by staples. The surgery was scheduled for the middle of December. I attempted to align my affairs, which entailed putting my car in the shop and arranging for a place to recuperate. I also made a will. I would have 2 weeks after my bleomycin dose, a period necessary in order for the medication to run its full course. During this time, I spoke to my social worker and requested that recuperative housing be arranged. She assured me it had. I was told that my recuperation would take up to 5 weeks. Winter settled in, and so did my fear. I was so tired, and it seemed to me at the time that the universe had no shortage of tests in line for me. After surgery, I awoke from the anesthetic stupor with a nurse telling me to stop what I was doing or I would break the bed. She looked frightened. I had no idea what she was talking about. I then sunk back into sleep. I was in and out of consciousness for some time. I was instructed how to use the morphine pump button. It did not take long for me to begin requesting more morphine as the heavy, intense pain engulfed me. The blur of pain continued for the next couple of days. On the beginning of the 3rd day, I developed large blisters on my left arm in which the IV was inserted. I was told that I had developed an allergy to morphine. The morphine was switched out for a synthetic analgesic, and the blisters slowly disappeared. I was asked about my discharge plans a number of times by the staff, and stated that I wanted to go to the hometel, as the extended stay facility was named upon discharge. Movement was beyond difficult, as the staples that held my abdomen together exacerbated the pain of the incision. In fact, my entire being was engulfed by the pain. I was the pain. I was not allowed to eat solid food for a couple of days. The food all tasted and smelled the same, like a mixture of medicine, antiseptic, and plastic. I hoped that I would heal quickly so that I could get my belongings and move to Portland. I had now fulfilled my obligations to California and could not wait to get away. I would need to be physically able to move. I was told that I couldn't lift more than 5 pounds, as any strain would cause the staples to come out and my intestines and vital organs would follow. After 5 days, my surgeon said that I was ready to leave. I packed my few belongings in the hospital room very slowly, for to bend or move too fast was extremely uncomfortable as the dull pain became sharp and intense. I was glad that I would only need to walk across the hospital campus to the long-term hometel. After the short walk, which seemed a great distance due to my intense pain, it only took a few minutes to learn that I was not qualified to stay there, as my home address on record was within 50 miles of the hospital. The fact that I was now homeless did not matter. Once again, I had nowhere to go. I lugged my bag back to the hospital's main building to speak to the social workers in an attempt to rectify the situation. To no avail. I was forced to return to the motel that had become my home. I would have to spend more of my 401k, which I had sold out of desperation, to stay there while I healed. I wished to go back to the lighthouse, but due to the 30-day-a-year limit, I was only allowed a few more days. It was a couple of weeks before Christmas. I made plans to travel to Los Angeles to visit a friend. I would then go to the lighthouse at Christmas. I spent time in the motel recuperating and becoming strong enough to travel. My days were a blur of painkillers, cable television, and bandage changes. It troubled me to perform the latter. I could hardly look at the incision. The friction against the inside of my shirt was painful enough to cut through the medication. I stayed as still as possible so as to avoid the discomfort caused by the friction. The days of loneliness merged, one into the next, and I passed the days fading in and out of a soporific sleep. I sometimes spoke on the telephone to the few people I could still count as friends. During this time of depression, loneliness, and desperation, these friends saved my life. I needed to be told to keep pushing. When finally able, I boarded the train to Los Angeles to visit my friend Joe, one of those I spoke with daily, whom I had not seen in about 10 years. The train route that I was on did not connect directly to Los Angeles, but was connected via bus. This meant that I would enter Los Angeles from the east. This entailed driving through an area of LA in which I had lived about 17 years prior. I stared out the window and watched Los Angeles rush by. I had never been so sick and so utterly alone. I stared at my reflection in the bus window as it merged with the halogen haze of Van Nuys whirring by on the other side of the glass. I was looking at a stranger. I was in the body of a stranger. I could taste the acridity of the poison and smell it on my skin. That city had once been my world. I was overwhelmed by it. I felt that if I got off the bus and stood outside, I would die of exposure. I would die alone. Once greeted by my old friend, this feeling passed, and I was filled with joy at seeing him. I was fortunate to spend some of my time healing in his home. I had begun to reconnect to parts of myself long abandoned, and it was a welcome reunion that would continue to play itself out in my healing. After a few days with Joe, I boarded the train north and stared at the Pacific Ocean as I returned to my world of isolation and sickness. I returned to the same motel, and after retrieving my car from the shop the next morning, I prepared to travel back to the lighthouse for Christmas. My abdominal wound was not healing properly, and it was necessary to return to the hospital to be seen. A painful blister had formed near my sternum. This was lanced, and I was taught to pack my own wound. I was afraid to do this, and although I was very uncomfortable staring into the hole in my chest and filling it with gauze, I forced myself. Then I headed back over the hills and toward the sea. As I made my way to the lighthouse, a winter storm swirled over the Pacific. There were only a few guests at the lighthouse, others, like myself, who traveled alone. The wind was almost gale force and whipped the rain against the windows. I could see the white caps forming on the waves to the north as darkness set in and the winds lashed the rain into the windows. I was thankful to be warm and safe. When the winter sun set quickly over the Pacific, I would return to my bunk to read Moby Dick. I was awestruck by the sea and terrified of the vast uncertainty it contained. Not only had I undergone an intense physical separation from some of my vital organs, and as a result the separation of the cancerous cells from my body, but in moving, I was leaving everything in my life to head off into the unknown, and I was afraid. The next stage of the alchemical process is the conjuncture, or the conjunction. This is a very trying time for the psyche. In this space, one is often wrestling with parts of oneself. This wrestling comes largely from the clash of opposites within us. The wrestling feels torturous and seemingly impossible to make sense of who we are in the thick of this malaise, shaking off attachments to beliefs or patterns, lingering in between the awareness of having survived a major separation of a previous life or way of being, and now confronted with all of the alarming newness and possibility of what could be. Heidegger writes, as I still had a great deal of psychic contamination, which I would need to separate, I knew I still had quite a bit of work ahead of me. And while I did have some reprieve from the chaos from which I had emerged, I was very depressed and anxious. I remained very identified with my shadow and had begun to realize and feel the loss I had suffered. This depression seemed to increase once I was removed from the continuous treatment I was undergoing, slowed from the pace of the Bay Area, and trying to settle into my new environment. He then quotes Marie-Louise von France, "The conjuncture happens in the underworld. It happens in the dark, when there is no light shining anymore, when you are completely out and consciousness is gone, then something is born or generated. In the deepest desolation, the new personality is born. When you are at the end of your tether, that is the moment when the conjuncture, the coincidence of opposites, takes place." The next stage is fermentation. Something new has been introduced into the psyche during the conjuncture. That something needs time to ferment in the psyche. This is a time of little activity. The action is being taken beneath the surface. The proverbial sauerkraut or beer is in the pantry and offers us nothing, and we must leave it alone. Heidegger writes, "In the morning, I rose naturally just after the winter sun. I had no motivation for anything. I did not care to eat. I did not care to check phone messages or email. I would open my eyes and stare out the window for long periods. Rather than looking at something outside, I stared through the bare branches of the trees in the front yard into the Douglas firs in the distance. When I did focus on anything, it was the crows flying in and out of the fir trees. I experienced no joy or happiness. I felt heavy and dull, and I could no longer cry. My fingernails and toenails began to fall off. I would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling for long periods. Somewhere within me was the kernel of hope that allowed me the energy to get myself to the doctor and seek help. The only positive of any kind was my hair coming back in. This was exciting and offered some hope. My hair was very soft. I was told this could happen after chemotherapy. It was during this period that I began to have a felt sense of my trials as being like the stages of the alchemical opus. The still strong feeling of having been cooked from the inside out in chemotherapy was overwhelming, and I related so deeply to the calcination procedure. Likewise, losing my hair and my fingernails and toenails reminded me of the putrefaction. The desire to return to my master's thesis was born in this darkness. I traveled to the library and began my study. I also had the desire to reconnect to family and friends with whom I had lost touch. My own experience of psychological fermentation was so commingled with my physical fermentation that it is rather difficult for me to separate the two. My depression, isolation, and loneliness, as it occurred simultaneously with my body casting off my poisoned fingernails and toenails, and the insomnia and other physical ailments, seemed to meld together into one mass of rotting, lifeless existence. It is in this rotting that fermentation begins to occur, as it does when grapes are removed from their life source, pulverized, and then left alone to transform into wine. I was alone, and he quotes from Jung saying, "As one must be alone if he is to find out what it is that supports him when he can no longer support himself. Only this experience can give him an indestructible foundation." The second to last stage is distillation. Here Heigl writes, "In the alchemical imagery, this stage is often depicted as a cleansing or washing. The joy of spring was not lost on me, as I too woke from my intense immersion in my studies and my self-imposed isolation to ready myself to move into my room at a home owned by a long-time friend. I was also involved in the interviewing process of a new job that was going well. It seemed that my story was unfolding before me in a perfect manner. My hematology-oncology tests came back clean. The time had arrived for me to begin to cull the notes that I had compiled over the previous few months and begin to write this work. My distillation had begun." In the final stage of the alchemical process, coagulation, Heigl writes very little, and he is aware of that. He states, "The seventh and final procedure in the alchemical opus is perhaps the hardest for me to discuss, as I feel, and this might be born out of my experience, that the opus is quite dynamic, and that rather than arriving at a place as if graduating from one level and qualifying for the next, we move in and out of the realms of being. For me, the deepest learning may be that each one of these procedures, each operation of the opus, may be occurring at all times, although without the intensity of the experiences related herein. And if I am not paying attention and actively engaged with the process, I am simply missing it, and consequently not deriving the fullest possible benefit. I have also learned that at the times in my life I have felt as if I have arrived at a spiritual plateau of any sort, I have been sorely mistaken." I think that this is an incredibly relatable lesson for all. The joy in keeping something personal, in not holding it up to scrutiny or analysis. I think that we each have our own version of this experience, of finding an internal peace after an experience of transmutation, and knowing intuitively that to declare ownership of this peace would be a fool's action. And as such, Heidegger closes his thesis with a word of real encouragement to all, that the memory and that the experiences that have transformed us are also able to live on with us, and we are able to be reminded of those experiences, of each stage, of all of the different moments of struggle and joy, of coming back to ourselves, of having to accept newness, of wrestling with newness, that as we go through these experiences, we can remember in our bones, we can remember how they felt before, we can recognize, and in the recognition, it hopefully becomes even easier and even more rewarding. To finish off this companion episode, I'm going to introduce the practice of Sankalpa within Yoga Nidra, as well as koshas, and I will give you a tiny bit of homework to prepare for when I upload the Yoga Nidra in a few days. So Sankalpas and koshas are not currently part of the main Yoga Nidras that I have been using so far in the podcast, but I'm going to be adding them to this one because they are especially effective for working with healing Yoga Nidras. A Sankalpa is known as a resolve. It is a statement that you can make each time you do the Yoga Nidra, or even in day-to-day activities you can repeat it. It is something to embed inside of your mind, a deep and enduring message to all parts of yourself. If you want a good starting off Sankalpa, you can choose, I am happy, healthy, and strong. But I also encourage you to find a resolve that really rings true and feels right when you think it. When discussing analyzing a dream and trying to interpret symbols, Jung suggests a very simple method. He suggests the feeling should be that it just clicks. It's always a difficult thing to try and explain, but we all know it when it comes. So play around with making different statements, different ways in which you can affirm to yourself that this is a state of being that you want to achieve, a level of health and well-being that is accessible. Try and keep it short and to the point, and make sure that you are able to repeat it exactly the same each time. And then with koshas, I won't go into too much detail, but in essence, a kosha is the Sanskrit term for a sheath. You have a physical kosha, an energetic kosha, and the mental kosha. So imagine that these are layers of yourself, your physical layer, energetic, and mental layer. Each layer is able to be imbued with images of health and light and strength as we do the Yoga Nidra. I also encourage you to look up images online for the immune system and images for the lymph system, as well as any images connected to the area that is most affected in your body. It really helps to have these visual aids to help us connect with our bodies. To close off part 1 and in preparation of part 2, I will leave you with this question. Are you willing to experience the light alongside the dark? The jasmine beside the garbage dumpster? With great love and care, I extend myself to you as you heal, and for many flowers to bloom along the edges of your mind. Thank you for joining us for this weekly companion episode. It really does add to the experience that you will have in Yoga Nidra. The Yoga Nidra will be uploaded in a few days, giving you time to reflect on the questions that I've asked you. Please subscribe to receive notifications for this new Yoga Nidra episode as well as for future ones. Thank you for adding your light and kindness to the world and for doing this important inner work. May the afterglow be as bright as the journey is deep. See you soon.